So thank you for joining us for this segment. We're going to be talking about what's been done across the country around managing the redistricting process. And there's been a fair amount of activity. So I've got Kathy Fung here from Common Cause California. She's actually the executive director there, as well as the national redistricting director for Common Cause. So welcome and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, Leah.
So we'll start off with, there have been a number of states where we've seen some recent activity around redistricting. Out of those, what are the ones that stand out most in terms of making a lot of progress toward reducing the impact of gerrymandering?
Right. I think that the states really kind of fall into two different buckets. One is states that have an initiative process, and those states like Michigan and Ohio, and now we're looking at states like Colorado and Utah, have been moving forward with pushing for reform that gets at the heart of the problem of redistricting, which is removing people who have a self-interest from the process and replacing that with a more transparent and inclusive process for redistricting. The other bucket is in states where there's been tremendous partisan gerrymandering, but because they don't have an initiative process, it's not easy to push for change. Certainly the legislature isn't always willing to give that power up. And so the route there for change has been to use litigation, to challenge the maps, and to try to create, hopefully, a standard for finding that partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional and therefore rein in what those states have been doing.
Right.
And states like that include Wisconsin, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Maryland, where we've made our way to the highest courts and we're now awaiting some kind of judgment.
Great. So when we see different states working towards ending gerrymandering, I know that a lot of them have had a different set of values enshrined in the processes that they're using to draw lines. And I know that kind of manifests in different ways. Can you share with us some examples of what the important values are that people are looking to add to that process?
Right. So I would say that in some states, the challenge has been that they're really in a state where there's a fairly equal number of, say, Democrats and Republicans, and they're looking for a compromise where they can create a group of people, oftentimes it's a bipartisan commission, where there's a set of checks and balances, right, between Democrats and Republicans so that no one party can overwhelm the other one or take advantage in a way that is extreme. So states like Ohio have pursued bipartisan commission reforms for both their state and their congressional line drawing that essentially creates a commission where no one side can totally take advantage of the situation and squeeze the other party out. That ballot initiative is due to be voted on by voters May 8th, so it's right around the corner, and we'll see if Ohio adopts that for the congressional lines. In other states, like Michigan, they have really looked to try to create a set of standards, but also to convene a group of people who would be entirely independent of the political establishment. And what they're looking for is a group of citizens who are diverse and represent the entire state's demographics, who are talented and thoughtful, and who come together without any specific tie or interest in how the districts will ultimately be drawn for personal or partisan reasons, right? So that group of citizens then would draw the lines. And the idea behind it is that redistricting really ought to be forward-looking. It ought to reflect where our communities and the testimony around changing demographics goes. And the only way to do that is to cut the strings that tie the current redistricting process to incumbents and party operatives and put it in the hands of a group of independent citizens to draw those lines. And so the thought is, let's make that a citizen-driven process, where community testimony and demographics are really the driving force behind how we draw the lines, as opposed to doing something where, say, the legislature has control and is always looking at how to preserve its own power.
Mm-hmm. So finally, that's really great context to have because it helps to give a sense for, what people really care about when they're creating these independent commissions. So what has the impact been of these different types of policies?
Yeah. Well, there have been a number of states that have had some version of an alternative to the legislature drawing its own lines or drawing congressional lines, right? And I would say it's on a spectrum. There's less than a half dozen that have something that I would say get close to an independent commission. In most states that have tried to create a commission, they started out by creating something that was essentially an equal number of Democrats and Republicans, and where there might be a fifth person who is quote unquote independent or not aligned with either of those parties. Oftentimes, those individuals have been directly appointed by somebody in the legislature or an elected official. So the direction that we've been moving is towards something that is even more independent than that. So states like California, and maybe if Michigan passes its initiative, would have something where the group of people who are ultimately chosen to draw the lines really are not chosen by the legislature. They have conflict of interest requirements that cut ties. So there can't be staff, they can't be family of legislature, they can't be donors of candidates. And really they're making those decisions independent of hopefully any ties or connections to the legislature or political and party interests. So that kind of independent commission can produce a number of things. One is that when it has hearings around the state, it's truly taking in testimony with an open mind, right? Without any bias towards trying to skew those lines to favor one party or another or benefit one incumbent or another. The second thing that it can truly do in listening to that community testimony is to be very forward-looking about where our demographics are moving us to, right? And so in California, we've had people who are moving from one part of the state, say the western coastal part of the state, more inland, and really thinking about where those population changes are happening, but also that our demographics in terms of ethnicity and race are changing, and so thinking about where the emerging communities are. And when you have a group of people who are not tied to party or incumbents, then they're much more able to reflect the changing demographics of the state by drawing lines that start to capture where those emerging communities are and not just kind of looking back to holding on to old constituencies. And then I would say the last thing is that in doing so, sometimes what happens is because they're not trying to protect incumbents or parties specifically, you end up with a lot of districts where there's a shakeup, right? So in California, a lot of incumbents were essentially displaced, and they had to campaign for the first time in a very long time to earn the right of being able to represent that district in a hard way, right? And then the second piece is that it's not always a gimme that one party or another will win that district. And so in some districts, there's a true fight between the two parties, again, to earn the votes of their constituents. That creates a very vibrant democracy where our legislature has been far more responsive to voters because they have to earn those votes. They can't just take them as a given. And our congressional members have been, I would say, again, far more responsive to voters. And it means that maybe there are some times when they're not taking an ideological or a party stance. They're really thinking about where their constituents are coming from. It also means that in our state legislature, we've seen far less gridlock and more ability for both sides to come together around really important issues.
Great. So thank you for that context. It's very helpful.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for joining us for this segment. We will hope that you continue to watch and listen and learn and join us as we continue the conversation around gerrymandering around the country.